Subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon to never miss an update from RAU'S IAS. Do not forget to subscribe to our Telegram channel for all the updates and materials.
Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper analysis from the perspective of civil services examination. Today we have taken up Delhi edition of The Hindu newspaper dated 29th of December 2021. The articles which we are going to cover today have been displayed on the screen, and let us now begin the discussion.
So we are going to begin today's discussion with a very important topic, especially from the perspective of GS paper 4, which is the matter of transparency. And this is because an article appears on page number 14 on editorial as a lead article, Put Out the Data, Boost the Dose of Transparency, in which the author claims that the government must make COVID-19 data, and just not the data on disease, but also the data for vaccine regulatory approvals and policy available to the public. Making an information available to the public is a matter of transparency, because information is power, and who controls the flow of the information is actually the one who is powerful. If you look into the GS paper 4 syllabus probity in governance, you can see that information sharing and transparency in the government is a part of your syllabus. And not just that, multiple times UPSC has asked questions on transparency, starting with the very basic one. Examine the relevance of the following in context of civil service. The number 1 was transparency and the number 2 was accountability. And so, realizing the importance of transparency in the good governance, we are going to discuss 5 important aspects of transparency. What it means, what happens if there is no transparency, what does the existence of transparency in governance ensures, what are the exceptions which should be provided for transparency, and what are the measures which the government of India has taken to ensure transparency. Of course, we are not going to discuss the RTI Act and issues related to it and how to go about it, because that has already been discussed in a DNS, as you can see on the screen. And so if you have to focus on just the RTI, that is Right to Information Act, which is the legislative framework for ensuring transparency in the country, you can go and watch that video. The link to that has been provided in the description. But this discussion is even more basic, which talks about just the transparency. So let us now begin the discussion. Now, whenever we talk about administration or governance, we always vouch or intend to make our administration or governance citizen-centric. So what are the ways in which governance or an administration can be made citizen-centric or good governance? And as you can see on the screen, this image has been taken from ARC report, Administrative Reforms Commission, the second report of ARC. And if you look into it, you can see consensus-oriented, participatory, follows the rule of law, effective and efficient, equitable and inclusive, responsive, accountable, and transparent. So you can see out of 8 pillars identified by ARC, transparency is one of them. And so transparency is very important. So what actually is transparency? What do we imply when we say that the government needs to be transparent? So if we have to define it, the term transparency refers to increased flow of timely and reliable information. So let us now zoom into what it means and try to understand it in more detail. As I've said, transparency means timely and reliable information which is accessible to all relevant stakeholders. In other words, transparency is the dissemination of regular and accurate information from the government to the people. And having a transparent framework of governance means that people have right over the government, over the information. So if the government is disseminating timely and reliable, accurate information to the people, it's not some kind of act of kindness which the government is showing. Rather, it is the right of the people to know about the relevant information. At the same time, it is an obligation on the behalf of the government to disseminate the information automatically. So transparency in governance is the idea that the people have right to know what their government is doing, and the government has an obligation to provide that information. And so what kind of information do citizens expect? It could be some criteria which the government is applying for, let's say, tendering process. It could be about the process itself and most importantly, how the government is arriving at a decision or the information related to decision making. For example, the selection of beneficiaries from any government scheme such as Skill India Mission would be based on explicitly known and publicly communicated criteria. It will also be known as to who will apply these criteria, when and how. So you can say, just like DNS is what, why and how of newspaper analysis, transparency is about what, why and how of each and every process of the government. And so you can say, in essence, transparency is about shedding light on rules, plans, processes and actions. So by now, I guess you understand the basic of transparency as to what transparency actually means. But have you ever wondered what happens in the absence of transparency in governance? What would happen if the systems and the processes of the government are not transparent? And so let us now understand what would happen in a governance system if it is not transparent or if it is opaque. So by now, I think you have understood that transparency is all about information. And we know that information is power. And that the executive at all levels, be it local level, state level or center level, attempts to withhold information to increase its scope for control, patronage, arbitrariness, corruption and unaccountable exercise of power. So for example, how do you control political funding? You do not tell public about who are the funders, which are the companies or the businessmen funding the particular political party. If you want to provide patronage, for example, by appointing your own political leaders or people belonging to your own political parties to the high offices, do not tell public about the criteria behind the selection of people in a particular constitutional or statutory body. You want to give out licenses or tender to a particular company? Be arbitrary. Do not tell public about the rules and regulations behind the tendering process. You want to acquire wealth if you are a government official? Do not tell public about the public expenditure or the government expenditure behind a particular scheme. And so you can see why, in real sense, information is power. And in other words, actually information is that currency which is required by every citizen to participate in the life and governance of a society. The greater the access of a citizen to information, the greater would be responsiveness of the government to the community needs. And alternatively, the greater the restrictions that are placed on the access to the information, the greater the feeling of powerlessness and alienation with the government. Because you have to realize that without information, people cannot adequately exercise their rights and responsibility as citizens or to make informed choices. And so you can say, in essence, information is actually a national resource. Just like other natural resources, for example, coal or water or uranium, people should have the primary control over the national resource of information. And you should understand that neither the particular government of the day nor public officials create information. Rather, it is created in the process of the governance itself. For example, the criteria for the selection of beneficiaries of a program like Manrega is created by the Parliament of India. And it should be communicated to each and every person in the country who intends to benefit from the program. And the government should not and cannot keep the selection criteria for the benefit program from the public. And so, you can say that the government and the officials are trustees of this information. And so, ushering in a transparent era or a start of an era of transparency in the governance means the transformation of the government or the government officials from acting like an owners of the information to acting like a trustees of information on behalf of the public. So, before RTI Act came, the government could deny all the information because it was thought that the government is the owner of the information. And just like any other owner, they can deny the information. Just like you can deny entry to anyone entering from your home, the government used to deny all the information. And then we thought transparency is very important. We create Right to Information Act, which actually made the government and the officials trustees of the public information on behalf of the citizens. So what happens when the government behaves like owners and not trustees? Lack of transparency on the criteria for selection of beneficiary leads to mistargeting of welfare programs. where the intended beneficiary often do not get the benefits, whereas the people who get the benefits are not the most desired ones. Then when the rules related to award of licenses related to natural resources or the national resources are not laid out clearly in the public. Or sometimes the rules are so complicated that it becomes very difficult for the people to understand them. Or sometimes the rules are changed arbitrarily without the approval or the consent of the stakeholders. Then it leads to massive corruption. And this is what happened in coal scam and 2G scam. Similar is the case when the government procures items for the public use. When the criteria for the procurement are not laid out in the public, to start with, the procurement process becomes flawed, and second, you cannot hold the government accountable because you do not know or you're not aware about the criteria chosen to select a particular service provider or a supplier of goods. Similarly, when the criteria for appointments are not laid out in the public, it creates a very opaque system of appointment, which then ultimately leads to inferior people getting into the governance, because of which the merit system of appointment is compromised. And then finally, to give you another example, when the details about government expenditure or the expenses of the government is not known to the public, on what criteria is the public going to judge a government or to hold them accountable? So now I guess you understand why is it very important for a governance to be transparent. And now is the time to understand what it ensures. So to start with, it ensures that the rights of the people are withheld, rights of the citizens are withheld. Because you should understand that in a democracy, governments are ultimately answerable to public. Public have a right to know what the government is doing, and hence the information pertaining to government functioning should be made freely available to the public. If the public does not know about its rights or the obligation of the government, how are the rights of the people going to be upheld? The framework of transparency is very important to provide equal opportunity to everyone in the country. Because a government is supposed to treat every citizen alike. However, there could be some vested interests that force government to favor a citizen over other. And if information sharing and transparency are built into the system, then such favoritism would be questioned and the authority concerned could be punished. So for example, suppose the government is recruiting for a certain post. The government is supposed to recruit the candidates based on merit and eligibility criteria announced in notification. And if the marks of all candidates are shared publicly, then the chances of favoritism drops automatically. Then the framework of transparency checks corruption. Because frauds mostly take place because of the confidence of not being caught. Many times, accounts and financial statements are guarded so that frauds played go unnoticed. And hence, frauds can be curtailed if and only if the accounts, financial statements, and other financial information is put in public domain. For example, suppose a government gas agency delivers gas cylinders by collecting cash from the customers. Every evening, the manager of the gas godown is supposed to remit the money into the government bank account. But since none is watching him or her, there is a tendency on his or her part to use the money for his or her personal purpose and may easily siphon off a significant amount of revenue. But if there is a website that reflects the actual sales position, then the gas agency manager is forced to remit the money to bank account. You can take another example. For instance, a ration depot dealer indulges in diversion of essential commodities to black market. Whenever a beneficiary approaches him, he would say that the stock has not reached the depot. But if there is a transparent system necessitating the display of stocks released to various depots in a public domain, then the dealer cannot deny stocks to the beneficiary, because the people can question him that the grains sufficient for 80 families were delivered at your depot and you have distributed grains only to 40 families, and so we can clearly see that there are grains still in your depot. So you can see that the transparency can prevent black marketing and corruption. And then finally, accountability. But before that, let us understand what accountability means. Accountability basically means liability of the government to answer the questions about its actions and decisions. And so in the simplest of the words, you can say accountability is basically answerability of the government to the public. And answerability can be ensured if and only if information about the functioning of the government is made available. And to demonstrate this, let's take another example. Suppose a government has awarded contract of building a flyover to a company A. And if there is a scope for someone to question the grounds on which the contract was awarded to this company A, then the government is likely to observe the principles of fairness and natural justice in awarding the contract. And someone would question such a decision if and only if he or she has the access to information pertaining to the methods and the criteria chosen for awarding such a contract. And so you can see that even for ensuring accountability, transparency is needed. And so if information dissemination or transparency, in other words, is so important, is infinite transparency desirable? Or transparency in each and every aspect of the governance? So should there be no check or opaqueness whatsoever? And the answer is absolutely no. We need some kind of check on absolute transparency. Because you need to understand that information sharing and transparency can promote probity in governance, infinite transparency could do more harm than good. And hence, two important kinds of checks are very important. And let us understand them one by one with examples. Information that harms any individual should not be disclosed or shared. Information that harms the law and order of the society should not be shared publicly. And of course, information that disturbs the security of the state should not be released in the public domain. And let's take example for each one of them. As far as harm to an individual goes, this is a clear case demonstration of public officials upholding the integrity. And they are threatened by mafias, corrupt people, political leaders. And so, for example, a mining mafia has applied for mining license. An officer has raised objection to it and made file notings against grant of licenses. And if that file noting is released in the public, the mining mafia may create problems for that particular officer. And so, this should not be released to the public as to what notings were made by a particular officer. Similarly, if CBI is investigating a high-profile murder case, and if the names of the witnesses are released in the name of transparency, then the lives of the witnesses may be endangered. Then as far as law and order situations are concerned, there are various instances where it is not appropriate to put the information in the public in the name of transparency. For example, let's say if a religious structure is coming in the way of a national highway, and for the construction of this infrastructure, the removal of the religious structure is very, very important. For that, the local administration needs security and the police protection. And say if the list and the date on which this is to be carried out is released in the public, then the removal might never happen. Similarly, there is no need for me to explain why, for the security of the state, it is important to provide exceptions to the framework of transparency. Then as far as privacy is concerned, we already know that it refers to guarding one's personal life from others. And so all the personal information that has nothing to do with public interest or public life should not be disclosed. And so after having discussed all the dimensions, one dimension still remains, which is about the measures taken by the central government to ensure transparency in the government processes. Of course, right to information is a step taken by the Parliament of the India, which is a legislative action, and we have seen how it has been discussed in the DNS before. But here we are going to look into the executive measures, which are equally important to ensure transparency. And to start with, one of the biggest steps which the government took was the creation of the GEM portal or Government e-market, which provided for listing of the products for individual categories of goods, services, and transparent buying or procurement from the government. So in the discussion which we just had, we understood how transparency is very, very important in the government procurement. And now there is a portal like Amazon and Flipkart where all the goods and services and their providers are registered. If you are a government official, you have to log in there and you have to go into the goods and services category you want to acquire, and you have to select the lowest bidder, which will be automatically done by the GEM portal. So for example, if a government office has to acquire a vehicle, they have to go and log in into their account just like you log into ELEARN platform, and there you are going to specify the car, number of seating capacity, what mileage do you want, and all the cars and the Eligible companies in the models will be displayed, out of which you can choose any one of them. So this is about procurement. Then the government has created e-office, which is a very effective, efficient and transparent inter-government and intra-government transaction process. Then the government has created FVMS, Foreign Visit Management System, which has been made operational for regulating and ensuring efficient and effective foreign travel of officers of Government of India from the rank of Additional Secretary and above for obtaining the approval of the Screening Committee of the Secretaries. We already know about AEBA, which is Aadhar Enabled Biometric Attendance, which enables real-time and flawless monitoring of employee attendance, thereby ensuring punctuality among employee and hence bringing the system of transparency within government. Apart from these measures, you already know about Citizens Charter and RTI, which have been discussed in DNS, and so there is no need for me to discuss them over here. So the next article which we have taken for discussion appears on page number 14 today. The trade defense. So the Central Board of Indirect Taxes and Customs recently notified the imposition of anti-dumping duty on 5 products manufactured in China in order to safeguard domestic producers from lower priced imports that DGTR had found as being dumped in Indian market. So dumping occurs when a country or a company exports a product at a price that is lower in the foreign importing market than the price in the exporter's domestic market. The biggest advantage of dumping is the ability to flood a market with product prices that are often considered unfair, and especially to the domestic industries. And so, a defensive mechanism has been created by all the countries, which is known as dumping duty, which is levied on a very cheap product to make it equivalent or almost equivalent to the domestic products. And this is clearly not the first time India has resorted to such policies. Such a measure should be seen as a part of India's quest for Atmanirbhar Bharat and to economically boycott China. However, certain economists have highlighted that economic boycott of China would be extremely challenging for India. And so in this regard, let us now understand 3 key things. The first is strategies to economically boycott China, the challenges which are associated with such strategies, and finally we will understand, is India well equipped to attract global MNCs from China. So let us now begin the discussion by first understanding what are the formal and informal strategies which India has adopted to economically boycott China. First is of course vocal for local, which is about exhorting Indians to buy only locally manufactured goods and refrain from buying foreign made goods, which in a way targets Chinese goods because China is the manufacturing hub of the world. Then second is about boycott of Chinese goods. It is one of the important strategies because if you look into the overall trade relations, India had a total merchandise trade deficit of around $102 billion in 2021. Out of this, China alone accounted for trade deficit of around $44 billion. And this higher trade deficit with India is on account of entry of cheaper Chinese goods into Indian economy. Not to mention that these Chinese goods range from high-end electronic goods such as mobile phones to even Ganesha idols and Diwali lights. The entry of such cheaper goods into India is undoubtedly benefiting China and adversely affecting India's domestic manufacturing. So one way to inflict harm on the Chinese economy is to boycott Chinese goods and instead promote domestic manufacturing. Then, the government of India is making its stringent policies as far as FDI norms are concerned to prevent the hostile takeover of Indian companies by Chinese firms. And this is especially true after COVID-19 pandemic that has led to large-scale decline in the share prices of the companies across the world. Chinese state-owned companies had taken advantage of such situation to pick up substantial stakes in the ownership of the companies across the world. And because of this, the government of India had tweaked the FDI policy, making it difficult for China-based companies to invest through FDI. Cancellation of projects awarded to Chinese companies is another step which has been taken by India. For example, just the last year, Dedicated Freight Corridor Corporation cancelled the project of signaling, which was earlier awarded to a Chinese company. Apart from this, government had asked BSNL and MTNL not to use Chinese equipment for upgradation of its network. Further, there are strong voices that Chinese-based Huawei company should be kept away from 5G trials. And finally, the last method because of which we are discussing this important topic today is the imposition of higher tariffs on Chinese goods to boost domestic manufacturing. So these are the 5 important ways in which India is trying to economically boycott China. So if we analyze these 5 strategies, we can easily understand that they are going to make it difficult for the Chinese goods and Chinese companies from entering into domestic Indian market. But the question which arises here is, would India gain from such a strategy? Would we be able to inflict substantial harm on Chinese economy to soften its stance towards border disputes? Now, to answer these questions, we need to dig deeper by considering facts and figures and nature of trade between India and China. Now, in order to understand whether the India's boycott would have any effect or not, you have to understand and compare the size of Chinese economy with that of India. So India accounts for only around 3% or 3.1% of Chinese exports. Similarly, China's FDI in India stands at hardly around $2.3 billion out of the total $50 billion annual FDI flows into India. And hence, boycott of Chinese goods would have minimal impact on Chinese goods and companies. Further, we must realize that Chinese goods and companies have made deep inroads into other countries, including Africa. So there is always a scope for China to enhance their exports to other countries if its imports to India decrease. And so even if we are very effectively boycotting Chinese economy and its products, it's not going to have much impact and rather minimal impact on its economy. Then, the second important aspect which you should consider is that the boycott of Chinese goods and imposition of higher tariffs on such goods may have an adverse impact on domestic manufacturing and job creation within India. And the reason behind that is the nature of trade between India and China. So boycotting of Chinese goods will impose additional manufacturing costs and could lead to losses of jobs. At the same time, we should be mindful of the fact that in some of the cases, we do not even have alternate suppliers. For example, China accounts for almost 3/4 of the global battery manufacturing capacity, and hence India's ability to adopt electric vehicles is critically dependent on China. And also, you should not forget that there is always a policy for tit for tat action by China in retaliation to boycott of Chinese goods. The Chinese government may impose additional tariffs on Indian goods entering its domestic market, and thus it would affect India's exports to China. And so the obvious question which arises is that whether there is a silver lining in boycott of Chinese goods or not. And for that, we have to go for an estimate put forward by Confederation of All India Traders, or CAIT. Almost 1/3 of the Chinese imports contribute low-tech goods that were either made earlier by Indians or still being made but in smaller quantities. These Chinese goods can surely be discouraged and replaced by local products and brands. And so we can ramp up the production of around 3,000 products such as toys, fabrics, kitchenwares, cosmetics within a very short period of time and substitute Chinese products worth $13 billion by local products. This would also give a big boost to MSME sector, which has been reeling under the COVID-19 crisis. So the substitution of Chinese goods and domestic goods is not a Herculean task. For example, within a short period of 2 months, India has become second largest producer of personal protection equipments. So this must give us confidence that India can repeat the same feat with respect to other goods as well. And so in the medium and long run, the government must stick to its stated goal of self-reliant India and try to reduce its dependence on China. The next article which we have chosen for discussion appears on text and context page, the James Webb Space Telescope. So all of you must have read about NASA's James Webb Space Telescope that was launched on 25th of December on an Ariane 5 rocket from French Guiana, South America. From the perspective of UPSC Civil Services examination, we already know how important science and tech is, especially from the perspective of prelims stage. A lot of questions from space science and technology have already been asked. Why this particular telescope is being considered a revolutionary step as far as space science and technology is concerned, and how is it different from its predecessor, the Hubble telescope. So the James Webb telescope and its revolutionary technology will study every phase of cosmic history, from within our solar system to the most distant observable galaxies in the early universe. It is, of course, a successor of the Hubble telescope. It is the most powerful infrared telescope of the NASA, and it is a joint collaboration among NASA, European Space Agency, and Canadian Space Agency. It is expected to reveal new and unexpected discoveries and help humanity understand the origins of the universe and our place in it. And so don't worry, we are going to discuss the concept and what are the objectives of this telescope in great detail. So why is this telescope being considered as revolutionary? And for that, you need to understand two important concepts associated with the telescope. First is its location. And the second is the concept of redshifting or redshift, which is associated with a physical concept or the concept of the physics known as Doppler's effect. Starting with the location. All of us know that the Earth reflects radiation in the far infrared region, which is called the long wave radiation, which is what is absorbed by the greenhouse gases. And so clearly, telescopes cannot operate near this region from the ground or the low Earth orbit. And also the technology to make telescopes see the universe in this region is very sophisticated. Hubble telescope, for example, the most powerful telescope operational till date, is positioned in the low Earth orbit and hence cannot operate in infrared IR region, because the radiation from the Earth's surface is so high that it is very difficult to distinguish between the one coming from the surface of the Earth and the one coming from the galaxies and the universe. And so, the James Webb Space Telescope, on the other hand, will operate in far infrared region and will be positioned in L2 or the Lagrange point 2. So what are Lagrange points? So they are the positions in the space where the objects sent there tend to stay put. At these points, the gravitational pull of the two large masses precisely equals the centripetal force required for a small object to move with them. These points in space can be used by spacecrafts to reduce fuel consumption needed to retain or remain in the same position. And so the L2 point refers to the second Lagrange point of Earth's Sun system, where the James Webb telescope will be located. It is ideal for astronomy because a spacecraft is close enough to readily communicate with Earth and can keep Sun, Earth, Moon behind the spacecraft for solar power and provides a clear view of deep space for our telescopes. So this was about the position or the location in the space. What about the concept of redshifting, which the telescope is going to utilize? And I will try to make you understand this concept, but you'll have to listen carefully. So we know that light is both a wave and a particle. And so if you consider, let's say this is a light wave being emitted from a source right here. And so the frequency of these peaks will decide whether it is an infrared or an ultraviolet or a visible light, depending upon the frequency of the peaks. But if this point keeps on moving towards this direction, which is that if it starts to accelerate in one of the directions, don't you think that this wave would get elongated? And so if originally this source was emitting, let's say, a visible spectrum, once it starts to travel in a particular direction with a very high speed, this wave would be stretched to infrared. And this is what is happening in the universe. Since the universe is expanding, all the stars are going away from each other, and so the frequency of the radiation from these stars is redshifting, or their frequency is reducing. The name redshifting itself shows the declining frequency, because if you look into the spectrum, WEBB, violet has the highest frequency, whereas the red has the lowest frequency. And the phenomena of redshifting means that if an object is emitting violet color and if it is moving very fast, you will see it in red color, or the color which will have less frequency or higher wavelength than violet. And so the telescope will directly observe a part of space and time like never seen before, because it will gaze into epoch when the very first stars and galaxies were formed around 13.5 billion years ago. Ultraviolet and visible light emitted by the very first luminous objects now have been stretched or redshifted by the universe expansion and arrives today as infrared light. So the light emitted around 13.5 billion years ago. And if it was a UV light, because of the expansion, because of the continuous movement of star in one direction, now when that light reaches the surface of the earth or the Lagrange point 2, it has already significantly redshifted from UV to infrared. And Webb is designed to see this infrared light and with unprecedented resolution and sensitivity. And so this will be a very powerful tool for studying the nearby universe. So the James Webb Space Telescope will see the already known universe with higher sensitivity and will see far side of the universe unknown till date. As far as quick facts are concerned from prelims perspective, it has 4 instruments: near-infrared camera, near-infrared spectrograph, mid-infrared instrument and near-infrared imager. The wavelengths it intends to cater is visible, near-infrared and mid-infrared. Location, of course, we have discussed, is Lagrange point 2. And so by using a technology known as transmission spectroscopy, the observatory will examine starlight filtered through planetary atmospheres to learn about their chemical compositions. So what are the goals and the objectives of this telescope? And so the first objective is to enable the humanity to take a look or a peek back into 13.5 billion years to be able to see the first stars and galaxies forming out of the darkness of the early universe. And so it is most likely going to end the dark ages. Telescope with its infrared sensitivity will help astronomers to compare the weakest or the faintest earliest galaxies to today's grand spirals and ellipticals, helping us to understand how galaxies assemble over billions of years. Then it is going to throw light on the birth of the stars and protoplanetary systems, because it will be able to see right through into massive clouds of dust that are opaque to visible light observatories like Hubble, where stars and planetary systems are being born. And it will also tell us more about atmospheres of extrasolar planets and perhaps even find the building blocks of life elsewhere in the universe. In addition to other planetary systems, it will also study objects within our own solar system. So this is about the James Webb Telescope. But when we are calling it revolutionary, it is important for us to tell us how and in what way it improves upon the already existing super powerful Hubble telescope. So the James Webb will observe primarily in the infrared range and provide a coverage of 0.6 to 28 microns. And if you compare the instruments on Hubble, you can easily see that they mainly cater to the ultraviolet and visible part of the spectrum. It could observe only a small range in infrared from 0.8 to 2.5 microns. And so you can clearly see that it has around 10 times more coverage as compared to the Hubble telescope. Then, as far as size goes, the James Webb primary mirror has a diameter of 6.5 meters, while Hubble had around a 1/3 of diameter of 2.5 meters only. And so Webb will have much larger field of view compared to the camera on Hubble. As far as distance goes, the James Webb near and mid-infrared instruments will help study the first formed galaxies, exoplanets and birth of stars, whereas Hubble can see the equivalent of toddler galaxies, while Webb telescope will be able to see baby galaxies. So you can see that as far as going back in time is concerned, the James Webb is going to take us right into the formation of the universe and the initial few million years, as compared to Hubble, which takes us back to not that long ago. So from the perspective of prelims examination, this is a very, very important discussion. Let us now move on to the next news. Lack of political will is the next article which we'll discuss, which has appeared on page number 15 today, and which talks about the disputed island of Kachateevu, which is situated in Park Bay. And the conflict between India and Sri Lanka has again flared up with the arrest of 68 Indian fishermen, mostly from Ramanathapuram, and Pudukkottai districts of Tamil Nadu by the Sri Lankan authorities between 18 December and 20th December, and also they impounded around 10 boats for poaching in territorial waters of Sri Lanka. So from the perspective of prelims examination, it is very important for us to understand the location of the Park Strait and Park Bay, which is an important marine zone between southeastern India and northern Sri Lanka, and it has been a source of dispute for long. It extends from Point Calimere of Nagapattinam to Mandapam Dhanushkodi of Ramanathapuram district over 250 kilometers. So this is Nagapattinam and this is Dhanushkodi. Towards the northwestern side you have India, and towards southeastern side you have Sri Lanka. And it has a very shallow and flat basin with an average depth of around 9 meters. And if you can see on the image, this location over here is the island of Kachateevu, which has remained in dispute since last 40 to 50 years. And this is what the author says, that the lack of political will on behalf of the government is the reason because of which this island still remains disputed. And so it is important for us to understand the reason behind this dispute, which goes back to 1921 when Madras and Ceylon representatives negotiated for delimitation of Park Strait and Gulf of Mannar. In 1974, that is after both India and Ceylon got independence, India and Sri Lanka signed agreement to decide international maritime boundary line. IMBL made Kachateevu a part of Sri Lanka despite the fact that it was once under the Zamindar of Raja of Ramanathapuram. Though ceded to Sri Lanka, the agreement, which did not specify fishing rights, allowed Indian fishermen to fish around Kachateevu and to dry their nets on the island. Another agreement in 1976 was signed, which restricted both the countries' fishermen to enter into each other's exclusive economic zones. And so the issue is that the Sri Lankan side of the bay has more fishes and Indian trawlers are more advanced and dominant, and therefore sometimes they cross the IMBL or International Maritime Boundary Line, given the fact that maritime boundaries are not clearly visible on the ground or on the ocean. And so in 1991, Tamil Nadu Assembly adopted a resolution demanding the retrieval of Kachateevu. During the Civil War and with modern borders under control of LTTE, the fishermen had easy access into the fishing grounds. In 2008, Ms. Jayalalitha moved to the Supreme Court to nullify the Kachateevu Agreement of 1974 and 1976. In 2009, as the war between Sri Lankan government and the Lite reached an end, the Sri Lankan government strengthened its security at maritime boundaries. And so in 2014, Centra informed the Madras High Court responding to PIL that Sri Lanka's sovereignty over Kachateevu is a settled matter and fishermen from India do not enjoy any right to engage in fishing activities in the region. So as far as the issue goes, few specialists favor the creation of international institutions of stakeholders for regulating the fishing sector in the bay. And hence in that order, it is time for the central government to provide alternative options to the local fishermen. In this regard, seaweed cultivation and processing, ocean ranching can significantly reduce the dependence of Indian fishermen on Sri Lankan waters. Let us now move on to the next news. This last article for discussion appears on page number 1. 2 more vaccine and drug join India's fight against COVID. So India has approved 2 more COVID vaccines, CORBEVAX and COVOVAX, and the antiviral drug Molnupiravir under the emergency use authorization. As we all know, currently, India uses Covishield, Covaxin and Sputnik 5 for vaccination. So CORBEVAX is a protein subunit vaccine and COVOVAX is a nanoparticle based vaccine. The vaccine has been approved by WHO under its emergency use listing and therefore will be available globally as a part of COVAX initiative to ensure that at least 40% of the world is vaccinated on priority. On the other hand, Molnupiravir is said to be promising drug for those with mild and moderate disease and also easily administered as a pill. So when it comes to various kinds of vaccine, it is always a good idea to visualize them together so that you can understand the differences between them. So we have 5 main types of vaccines: live attenuated vaccine, inactivated vaccine, subunit vaccine, toxoid vaccines, and biosynthetic vaccines. As far as live attenuated vaccines are concerned, they contain a version of the living microbe that has been weakened in the lab so it cannot cause the disease, and the best example of that would be MMR vaccine. As far as inactivated vaccines are concerned, the virus is first killed with chemicals, heat, or radiation and then used to make the vaccine. Inactivated vaccine, they usually do not require refrigeration and they can be easily stored and transported in freeze-dried form. For example, the vaccine against hepatitis A, influenza, and polio. Whereas subunit vaccine contains a piece of virus that is important for immunity, like the spike protein of COVID-19, and the best example of that is the vaccine against human papilloma virus. Toxoid vaccines, on the other hand, contain a toxin or a chemical made by a bacteria or virus. They make a person immune to the harmful effects of the infection instead of the infection itself, for example, diphtheria and tetanus vaccines. Biosynthetic vaccines, on the other hand, contain man-made substances that are very similar to pieces of virus or bacteria. For example, the vaccines which are under trial or research mode against HIV virus. So this is it for today. Let us now move on and have a look at the question of the day.